It's the same hustle, it's the same thing, the same tears on everything. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one ghetto.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of Discussions with Indigenous Education, the Genocide of the Dark-Skinned Indian. We are getting close to the end of this season, and today we are still discussing stage 5, right? Organization. And so I think this is the third show about organization. This is a deep stage of genocide, and one that we think that we really wanted to make sure we took our time with, and we're kind of doing it from chronological order from the organizing of the United States, right? Because when genocide occurs, it's occurred, by a state, by an organization. And so we did go through some history of pre-United States foundation, right? Colonial periods. Let's go over what we've been through as far as stage 5 organization so far, and then we can jump into this episode, right? And so in the last episode, we talked about the Indian Affairs. It was established in 1824. An authority was given to it in 1832, right? We talked about the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and that the Indian Affairs Office became responsible for carrying out the Relocation Act, right? We talked about the Indian Relocation Act. Recognized that there were over 70 removal treaties. People don't get to talk about that much, right? And that initially the Office of Indian Affairs was under the War Department, and it wasn't until 1849 that it was transferred over into the Department of Interior. And I guess that's really where we can start now, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was managing the land, right? And so they moved the Indians from the War Department to now the Department of Interior, where they're managing the lands, which was really what the wars were about, to get the land.
Yes.
And so let's start from here. Again, I think the last date we mentioned was 1849, and that's when the department was finally removed from the War Department and put into the Department of Interior. And I guess that's where we can begin.
Okay, and and this is now when they basically have the tribes settled into what they were calling Indian country.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Indian country.
Yes. And Indian country was anything that was west of the Mississippi River that was not already claimed by the United States, maybe a territory or whatever, a state or whatever. So if it wasn't claimed by the United States, anything west of the Mississippi was Indian country.
So let's name some of the states that was part of Indian country, just so that people can get an idea of what part of the United States we're talking about right now.
Okay, well, really, everything west of the Mississippi was considered Indian country. But basically, they were being settled in Kansas, in Nebraska, and Oklahoma, and those were the areas basically where they were getting settled in.
Okay, yeah. And so again, in the last show we were talking about the Indian removals, right? And that they had 70 different removal treaties. One of the things that me and you were talking about as a part of them doing the removing was that they were integrating tribes together, right? And so that they were forcing various tribes to go on one piece of land as a collective group, right? And so that's how you might have Lenape with Cherokee, or you might have Choctaw with
another group.
Some other group, right? Some Seneca folk maybe, or something like that. They were just lumping us all together and sending us over here to one particular place. But let's talk about how that was happening. Again, it's 1949, 1950. Indian country is being established, And, what was the government, the roles, the authorities, what was going on with that?
Suddenly they were getting this Indian population, getting them settled where they feel where they have a little bit more control over this population. Okay. And once they got over there, and again, because they were signing all of these treaties, they were basically signing these treaties with tribes now that they are considering civilized.
Okay.
So the area that the Indian country is really not considered part of the United States. It was considered to be an area where the indigenous population could go and where they can be autonomous and not really be too concerned about, I guess, the United States government or anyone else usurping any authority over the tribes.
But of course, that didn't work out too well. Okay, so again, 1849 is when they finally removed the Department of, what is it called?
Now it's called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, not the Office of Indian Affairs.
It's called the Bureau of Indian
Bureau
Affairs.
of Indian Affairs, yes.
And so in 1849, they moved that Bureau of Indian Affairs from the War Department into the Department of Interior. They started dealing with land management, and now we have another problem, right?
Yeah, so now we need to come up with some acts.
Okay. Some acts. All right, and why would these acts be necessary?
Well, I mean, Indian Appropriation Acts to appropriate this Indian population, okay?
Well, I thought that the land was theirs, right? I thought that, they moved us west so that we would be able to just do our own thing, but it is another problem, and don't mind me jumping in. I want to mention that it was called the westward expansion, right? Because now you got all these Europeans, right, and these colonizings just want to spread west for the fake gold rush, definitely the land rush, right?
And well, we did a show even, and we talked about this previous, the manifest destination.
Which was really what everything is, right? That manifest destiny, right. And so manifest destiny theory is actually being promoted around this time, right?
Yes.
They pushing it in Congress. Again, you can look at some of the previous shows about that. And so now they okay, we got to control the Indians even more, right? So, let's talk about the Indian Appropriation Acts.
Okay.
Well, you know what?
The first one
Before
is...
we start that, before we go, because, I don't want us to start there and then have to take a break. So I'm going to take a break right here, and when we get back, we'll start talking about the first Indian Appropriation Act. Sound good?
Okay.
All right. So we'll be right back with more discussions with Indigenous education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian.
You're watching Discussions with Indigenous Education.
Welcome back to Discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian. We're talking about stage 5, which is organization. And right before the break, we were just about to get into the Indian Appropriation Acts. And so I think you said the very first act we were going to start from?
Is 1851. I'll
Okay.
make sure that I'm getting the right date here.
Yeah. All right. So, so now it's 1851. It's a few years after the Bureau of Indian Affairs is moved from the War Department to the Department of Interior, and they want to control their Indian population some more.
Yes. So the thing, again, to get control, that the first thing that they did was they created reservations for the tribes.
Okay. So this is where reservations start to come into place.
Yes. And then when they provided the reservation, they had to give up their previous lands. And then, of course, when they were doing this, the plots of land, of course, were smaller.
Well, wait a second. I know when we started this organization episode, we were talking about how some of the friendly Indians were being given large amounts of lands, well, relative to today's standard anyway, right? And that, our lands were, supposedly specifically for them to do as they choose to, as a friendly tribe. But now, we're starting to move away from that. And so what did the Reservation, Act do outside of, well, again, you said that they had to give up their previous lands, and then they had to move on to another settlement?
They had to move on to the lands that the United States provided for them.
Okay,
And again, well, and it's definitely a smaller piece of land. And so now the tribes are having to acclimate to that, not only being in a strange part of the country that they've never been to before.
They don't know what the forest, they don't know how to use the lands for the dirt.
Right, they don't know what will grow there and what will not. They know all those things in their homeland.
Okay, and so they going through all of this, and then something really big happens, right? Because we're talking about 1851. And if anybody's familiar with what was going on in the United States around that time, what happens next?
Well, a big thing that happens
A
next.
big thing, right?
Okay, which is the Civil War.
The Civil War. Oh my gosh, right. So now the Civil War happens, and we have, the Civil War. Everybody knows what happens with respects to the United States is concerned. However, the tribes, right?
Right, because they're fighting in an area that was their homeland. And because of that, many of them fought with the Confederacy.
Right, because they were trying to keep their lands. We do have these colonizing states, organizing themselves on our jurisdiction in our lands.
And also the Cherokee were also able to have an eastern branch that did not move west of the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And so those are people now that they have to be concerned about because again we're talking.
Right. We're talking about our people here. And so a lot of the tribes were fighting on the side of the Confederacy.
Yes.
And so what happens when the Confederacy loses, right? What happens to a loser in the war, right? Interesting enough, and I'm not talking about the white people that lost, because the white people that lost got concessions, and which is why we are in the position that we are in right now, a few days before, an election where we have decisions to make here in the United States. They actually were given olive branches as a part of their thing. That's not a part of this conversation here. But of course, after the Civil War, slavery was abolished, and so now the tribes have to go through another situation.
Right, and well, the biggest thing is that wait a minute, y'all fought with the Confederacy, and now we are a union now. So now what do? We have to punish these people somehow because they participated with the enemy. Well,
yeah, they. Interesting enough, even they tried to help my brother, right? That's really what it is. And so we're going to hurt you more than we're going to hurt our brother because you picked the wrong side,
Yes.
And so...
So then what happened is that in 1866, the 5 civilized tribes in particular had to come up with new treaties.
Okay.
Okay.
Even new treaties now.
Yes.
All right. Okay, go ahead. I'm listening.
Yes, but now with these new treaties, they had to to reaffirm their loyalty to the United States government.
Then they do that. Wasn't they doing? Well, again, it's a new government now because we had the war. We're reorganizing it, and so now, almost to the point where those old things don't matter no more because we are so drastically different with respects to our administration that we got to do this over again.
Right, and because you did some things that you weren't supposed to under that last treaty that we had.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you were supposed to remain loyal to us, but you did not.
Okay, and so now you gotta. Okay, and so now we are a few years later, and we have another Indian Appropriation Act, right?
Yes.
And they just keep coming and coming and coming, right? But before we begin this next, well, you know what? What was the name of this Indian Appropriation
Well,
Act?
this one was the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871.
Okay.
Okay, so this is 20 years after
The first act.
The previous act.
The previous act, and again recognizing that the Civil War happened in between, right? And so we're gonna take a break here, and then when we get back, we won't have to take any more breaks, and we can really get into this and stretch out a few years and explain some of these things and how the United States used the militia and organizational administration tactics to commit the genocide, not just against the dark-skinned indigenous population, but the indigenous population of the United States. However, particularly the brown and darker skinned population. So we will be right back with more discussions with indigenous education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian.
You're watching Discussions with Indigenous Education.
Greetings and welcome back to Discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian. Right before the break, we were about to get into the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871. You know, but one more thing that I wanted to mention before we move forward with respects to the Civil War and some of the things that the tribes now had to acquiesce authority to. You know, one of the things that we didn't mention, we'll get to it in a minute, is not only that they had to abolish slavery and they had to grant citizenship to former slaves of that tribe, now called freedmen, right? We're gonna get into that in a minute, right? But in 1871, the United States organized another Indian Appropriation Act. So let's talk about what that Appropriation Act did.
Well, the biggest thing that it did, it ended making treaties with the United States. So after this point, it's like, okay, you know what? Yeah, no more treaties.
Okay. Okay, it's a wrap. We want full control over this situation. And you know what? It can be a headache for them too, because, you know, states making, you know, it's like, wait a second. It's too much jurisdictional quandary they were in.
Yeah, so let me read some of the words that were in that act.
Okay.
Okay. It says, no Indian nation or tribe within the territory of the United States shall be acknowledged or recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty.
I'm glad you read that, right? Because that's really important with respects to this conversation, right, as far as genocide is concerned. Because again, we have to remember that genocide with respects to stage 5 organization, we have to show proof, right? And not only do we have to show proof, but we also had to show intent. Remember, intent matters so much.
Yes.
Even today, it's hard to prove an individual's intent, right? And so here we can see their intent with respects to organizing these laws is to dismantle the laws of another country, another group of people, right? And this happened in 1871. It's in the books, right? And it's definitely is one of those things that I'm going to use as a verifying mechanism that our entities were was destroyed in a organized fashion.
Intentionally.
Intentionally, yeah, which is intentionally. Wow, okay. And so now after 1871, there is no more treaty making with any tribe?
Not with any tribes, okay? But now, you know, there's still an Indian problem, okay?
It's still an Indian problem today, you know.
True that.
Okay, but what was the Indian problem?
But again, now, again, we have to remember what is going on at the time.
Okay.
You know, we have this, you know, this Indian country, or now really it is now being called territory now. Okay, because now some of the country is getting whittled away. You know, because the Europeans, the Manifest Destiny and everything, they're moving in, and so they're taking a lot of the land, and so Indian territory or Indian country is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking to get basically, you know, what it is today, which was just Oklahoma, you know, which is just, you know, which is really what it turned out to be.
And even that was a problem for them.
Okay. But one thing is again, with the Europeans moving in, and they are seeing things with the indigenous people that they did not like.
Okay.
Okay, and one thing that happened was that there was two chiefs of the Sioux Nation.
Okay. Okay.
Where one chief killed another chief.
Okay. That's their business, right?
Yes,
that's
and
business.
because they're in Indian on their land, the trial took place in their territory, on their land.
Wait a sec. I'm gonna sidetrack us for a sec. Wait a sec. Did you just say trial? They had a trial for a chief?
Well, they settled their disputes. You know, so it could, you know, in council or whatever, but there was they settled disputes. There was and these things it was confusing to the Europeans, okay, because if there was something like this that happened, and then the tribes, okay, let's say that two tribes are fighting, okay, and then a man got killed as part of that. So when the tribes would get together, what they decided on is like, okay, well, you know what? This man is missing from there, so we are going to replace that man to that family, to that tribe, and now they are their slave. But again, that is the way that slavery was practiced within the indigenous communities, but the Europeans saw it in a different manner.
You know, okay, I'm gonna backtrack in a second, but interesting enough. So that would, to me, interesting enough, make me think twice about doing anything as a man, right? Because I don't want to be responsible for somebody else's stuff. Right? I got to be responsible for their children. I got to be responsible for feeding them, for housing them. If I got to build another home for my daughter, like they literally became the caretaker for that family.
Yes.
Which was the reason why you didn't have a lot of that happen here, because they no man try to take care of no other man's family. I mean, realistically speaking, when you realize that, dang, I got to be in servitude to a bunch of people for the rest of my life, you know what?
And that is not a part of my family. That's part of maybe another tribe.
Right.
You know,
you ain't worth killing. You know, I mean, realistically, like, Dad, you got how many? You got 18 kids that I got to take care of? I'm not, man. I'm going to walk away.
But then also, though, is that the reality of it is that eventually that person really becomes
a part of the family.
Of that tribe.
Right. How could you not sooner or later start caring for the people? You building their houses, you going fishing for them, you got to feed, you know. And it was a way for the tribes to stop the beef, too. Right. Well, you started this, so now you got to go over here and replace it. But the chiefs were not exempt from the law.
Right.
You know, something that even some of our politicians today is trying to be, you know, very civilized of us, even in 2026, 2024, 2025. But okay, so particularly, let's talk about this court case for a second, because, you know, let's mention the name, and I see we have some things. So let's like read it so that they can be familiar with this particular case, because this one really does matter.
Oh, okay. Well, it just says that it was a Lakota Sioux man, Crow Dog, had killed another Sioux chief, Spotted Tail, on their reservation. Crow Dog was tried and convicted in a tribal court according to Sioux law, which involved a compensation settlement to the victim's family, not imprisonment or execution. However, many non-Native Americans viewed this outcome as too lenient.
And because a lot of the Europeans in the surrounding areas considered it to be too lenient, they started fussing, they started arguing, and now we have another Indian Appropriation Act that comes up to place, specifically because of this 1883 court case.
Yes,
right?
yes, and well, it doesn't. We didn't really know that when we were doing this research and everything. But I mean, there's no way that
It's like a year later.
yes,
Specifically
because that
dealing with this.
happened in 1883. Okay, but in 1885. So,
Okay.
So 1885
Right.
is when this new act came out, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1885, which is also called the Major Crimes Act.
Right. So some of our viewers may be familiar with just even the term or the name Major Crimes Act, and recognizing that there were a few, my mom had to let me know, there were a few different Major Crimes Act, because I'm like, wait a minute, which? This particular Major Crime Act was 1885, and what did it do?
Okay, this one, it gave the United States jurisdiction on murder, manslaughter, rape, assault with intent to kill, arson, burglary, and larceny.
So it took the jurisdiction away from the tribes and gave those crimes, basically so-called federal crimes till today,
Right,
right, over to the government, the United States government.
To the United States government, yes.
And so basically any criminal matter, right?
Yes.
And interesting enough, one of the things that we didn't mention as a part of the last Appropriation Act was that it also made all Indians wards of the state, right? And so it took it made them citizens, not just citizens, they actually use the term ward. We'll get into that conversation later, but all...
Yeah, because they didn't become official citizens
Right, they were
until-
wards.
Yeah, right.
All right, but with this, it's 1885, we have the Major Crimes Act. They have taken control over all criminal matters with respects to the tribes, but the tribes still had jurisdiction over their civil matters.
Yes, and they still had, let's just say they had more autonomy than the United States was comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, because in a year later or 2 years later, we got another situation that happens.
Another
right?
act.
Another act, okay. And I think this might be the last act that we can get to for this show. So let's talk about this act real quick.
Okay, and it's probably a name that a lot of people are now familiar with, especially people, indigenous people, or people that have been trying to find out what their ancestry is. And this was the Dawes Act, or it is called the Dawes Severalty Act, or it was also called the General Allotment Act of 1887.
The General Allotment Act is interesting, right? But everybody knows the Dawes, right? Not too many people know who Dawes was, right? So who is Dawes?
He was a state legislator.
In Massachusetts.
He was the
right?
senator. Was it the senator?
He was a senator.
Okay, all right. So he was the senator of Massachusetts.
Okay, and let's pause it here because it's time for us to wrap this show up. And so before we get all into who he is, and I know y'all want to know about the Dawes and how this relates to the Stage 5 organization with respects to the genocide of the brown and dark-skinned Indian. It's been a show so far, man. But I hope that stay tuned because when we get back, we'll start getting into the General Allotment Act, the Dawes roles, and some other things with respects to Stage 5 and organization, right? Anything you like to say before we wrap this show up?
Well, this this organization is a lot.
Yeah.
And the thing is that even after we do this, there's still
There's some more to
more.
yeah.
There's a lot more.
All right. Well, of course, this is my mother, our co-founder, and our co-host, Renee Sanders, also known as Red Silver Fox. I'm your co-host, Tabitha Sanders, also known as Red Tail, and we hope to catch you next time on Discussions with Indigenous Education, the Genocide of Dark-Skinned Indian.
It's the same hustle, it's the same pain, the same tears on everything. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one.